I didn't cry when he kissed me. I cried after. When his hands had left my skin, when the room had gone still again, and I was lying there, open, silent, not sure if I'd just been broken or born. That night, he didn't say my name. Not once, but everything he did carved something permanent into me, and nothing about me was the same afterward. If you feel something already, take a moment to like this video. And if you believe love can begin in the most unexpected places, subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the last word. If you ask me what a promise smells like, I'd tell you it smells like cinnamon and old paper. There's a wooden box in our kitchen. Nothing fancy, just a cracked pine thing with a brass latch and a faded tulip painted on the lid. It used to belong to my father. He kept receipts in it, spare buttons, and every letter he never had the courage to send. I was 8 when I first found it. I remember thinking how heavy a piece of paper could feel when you knew it was meant for someone who might never read. And this morning, that box was sitting open on the kitchen table. Sunlight poured through the window, landing softly on the stack of letters. Outside, snow had started to fall again, the light kind that doesn't stick, just dances through the air like it's remembering something. I was stirring honey into my tea when the phone rang. Not the landline, the cell, the one we only keep charged in case of emergencies. Miss Emma Carter? A clipped male voice. Businesslike. Sharp, like the edge of a suit pressed too hard. My name is Thomas Lynn. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Nathaniel Anderson. He would like to meet you. Today, if possible. I blinked. Excuse me? I'm sure the name is familiar. Your father once worked for the Anderson family. Mr. Anderson has inherited a matter tied to your father's estate. A personal one. By 3 p.m., I was 31 floors above Manhattan, standing in an office so sleek it looked more like an art gallery than a place where decisions about millions of dollars were made. Nathaniel Anderson didn't stand to greet me. He just looked up from the window he was staring out of and said, "You look like him." I wanted to ask who he meant, my father or someone else, but I didn't. He gestured to the seat in front of his desk. I sat, knees together, hands in my lap, trying to look smaller than I felt. "I won't waste your time," he said. His voice was deep, even, like it had been carved into him years ago and never changed since. "There's a matter between our families that needs to be resolved. Your father owed mine a debt." I blinked. "With respect, Mr. Anderson, my father's been gone 5 years, and he was a tailor, not a gambler." Nathaniel slid a file across the desk. Inside, a contract, neat legal text, thick with consequence, and tucked beside it, a letter. My breath stopped. "I believe this belongs to you." I took the letter with trembling fingers. The paper was old, but preserved, creased from having been opened many times. It was in my father's handwriting. I knew it instantly. Those careful strokes, the habit of underlining words he thought might be missed. But this letter, it shouldn't be here. It was the one he wrote the day after the accident, when Mr. Anderson Sr. fell from his horse on the icy trail behind our town. My father had been there. He'd pulled the man out of the ravine and carried him 3 miles, back to safety. It was never meant to be public. Just a note of quiet gratitude. "I found it among my father's things after he passed," Nathaniel said. "But someone else mailed it years ago. A duplicate. It was not for my eyes, I think, but it explained enough." The words blurred as I read them again. "To Henry Anderson, there are debts a man can repay in dollars, but what you gave me that day, trust, work, the bread on my table when I had none, that is not a debt I can pay back in this life. But I will pass it on. That's the best I can do." Samuel Carter Nathaniel folded his hands. "I am not asking for money. I'm asking for something only you can give." There was a long silence before he added, almost clinically, "Marry me." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt like the only possible reaction. He didn't flinch. This is not a romantic proposal, Miss Carter. This is legacy, appearance. The Anderson name has always stood for loyalty. Quiet, unsentimental honor. I intend to protect that. My heart pounded. Why me? Because you are your father's daughter. And because in 12 months you can walk away with everything settled. No obligations. I'll cover your mother's treatment. I'll help your brother finish school. I won't touch you, not if you don't want me to. But I need a Carter standing beside me. Someone who understands what a vow costs. I should have walked out. I told myself to. But then I thought about Mom. How she tried to hide the shaking in her hands last week when she sliced apples for pie. The unpaid hospital bills. And the way my father always said, there are debts you don't dodge, Emma. Not the ones that shape your name. I stood. My legs felt like water. I'll need one night to think. Nathaniel nodded. You have until morning. Then the offer is withdrawn. I turned toward the elevator. The steel doors gleamed like mirrors. My reflection looked older than it had that morning, like someone who'd aged a decade since breakfast. That night, I went home and opened the pine box again. The original letter was still there, 2 copies. 2 lives, 1 promise. At 6:12 the next morning, I returned to the tower. I wore my church dress. I tied my hair back like Mama used to when she meant business. I walked into Nathaniel's office, picked up the pen he'd left by the contract, and signed my name. I'm not doing this for you, I said. I'm doing it for the man who taught me what a good name is worth. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted. Just barely. I left the office that day with a ring in a velvet box and a calendar date set. No music, no flowers, no fairy tale. Just a girl with her father's last name, walking into a marriage built on silence, legacy, and a letter that should never have been mailed. The house didn't look like a home. It rose out of the Vermont woods like a fortress. Stone, steep-roofed, as if designed to withstand storms that hadn't come in centuries. Snow clung to the gutters. The long, winding driveway made no apology for how unwelcome it felt. The driver didn't speak much, only nodded when I thanked him before I stepped out. My boots sank slightly into the fresh snow, and my breath fogged the air in front of me as I stood at the front doors, wondering what I was doing. It had only been 4 days since I signed that paper. A document that somehow tethered me to a stranger whose eyes hadn't changed expression once during our first meeting. 4 days since I looked my mother in the eye and told her I was going away to work. I didn't tell her I was getting married next week. I didn't tell anyone. Inside, the warmth was instant but impersonal, like the heat was meant for the furniture, not the people. The entrance opened into a vast hall of polished wood floors, high ceilings, and hushed corners. My heels tapped faintly as I followed the butler. Yes, there was an actual butler named James, through a series of rooms that looked like magazine spreads no one had dared live in. Then he left me, just like that. No welcome, no directions. Wandered into what looked like a sitting room. Bookshelves lined the walls. There was a fireplace, unused, and a grand piano under a sheet. But it was the photograph on the mantel that stopped me. I moved closer, fingers instinctively reaching toward the wooden frame. My father, young, maybe 25, standing beside another man, taller, broader-shouldered, but with the same quiet kindness in his eyes. Nathaniel's father. They were smiling, not politely, not like business partners, but like people who'd known struggle together. The fire didn't crackle behind me, but something did. A footstep. You knew, I said without turning. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, arms folded. That my father worked for yours? That they were friends? I didn't know until I found the letter, he replied. But you kept this. He walked into the room. The air moved with him. Not heavy, but deliberate, like he knew how to take up space. I kept it, he said. because it reminded me that my father was capable of trusting someone. There was a beat of silence. And then, "Not because of the debt?" He shook his head. "No, that came later." I sat, partly because my legs felt unsteady, partly because it gave me an excuse not to look at him. He remained standing, always a little taller than necessary, always precise. "I need to make something clear," I said, softly but firmly. "I'm not playing a role for your board of directors, or your press secretary, or whatever PR stunt. This is." He looked almost amused. "There's no stunt. I don't do press. And my board doesn't care who I marry, as long as I sign checks on time. Then why me?" His reply came too fast. "Because no one else would understand why it matters." I looked up then. For the first time, really looked. His features were sharp, yes, but tired, like someone who hadn't rested in a long time. "There's a chapel down the road," he said. "I've booked it for next Thursday. Small, private. You'll have everything you need. Clothes, papers. You just have to show up." What if I change my mind? A pause. "You won't." Later that evening, I explored the guest wing I was assigned to. It was twice the size of our entire house back home. There was a fireplace, its flame flickering quietly. A writing desk made of dark walnut. A walk-in closet lined with dresses in shades I'd never owned, silk, cashmere, lace, each one chosen without asking what I liked. On the bed was a card. No note inside. Just a schedule for the wedding day. Everything printed. Impersonal. Impeccable. My throat tightened. This wasn't what marriage looked like in the stories Mama used to read aloud. It wasn't love, or partnership, or even companionship. It was paperwork, punctuality, polished silver and polite indifference. Before bed, I took a walk outside. Snow had stopped falling. The air was sharp, but not cruel. I found a bench at the edge of the garden. Or what would be a garden if it weren't buried under white. I sat, wrapped my coat tighter, and stared at the trees. And that's when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. He didn't say anything, just sat at the other end of the bench. Enough space between us to stay strangers. "I hated this house," he said after a while. "When I was a boy, too many locked doors." "Still feels that way," I replied, surprised at my own boldness. A ghost of a smile. "It hasn't changed much." "Why live here then?" "Because it's the only place that remembers who my father was." I turned to look at him. "And what about who you are?" His jaw shifted, just slightly. "I'm someone who doesn't believe in second chances." We sat in silence, and I thought about my mother, hands wrapped around a warm teacup, humming while the snow fell outside our kitchen window. I thought about my father, sewing in the glow of lamplight, mending other people's clothes with care he never spared for his own. And then I looked at the man beside me, alone in his own legacy. I didn't know if I pitied him or understood him. Maybe both. When we stood to leave, our hands brushed accidentally. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. Something passed between us. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. A soft, wordless truth. We were both here because of men who kept their promises. And now we would keep ours. There are sounds you don't forget. The rattle in a mother's breath when she's too proud to say she's in pain. The hush of a nurse trying not to alarm you. The mechanical beep of a heart monitor trying to convince you everything is fine. That morning, I heard all of them at once. I wasn't supposed to be in town. I had told the Anderson staff I needed a few days before the wedding, to adjust, I said. But the truth was, my mother's voice had trembled on the phone the night before, and I couldn't ignore it. So I borrowed a car. Drove 3 hours through freezing rain. Pulled into the hospital parking lot with coffee gone cold and hands gone numb. Room 204, respiratory ward. My brother Matthew was sitting in a chair beside her bed, clutching a book he wasn't reading. She didn't want me to call you, he said, not looking up. Mama was asleep, pale, too still. She's getting worse, he added, his voice low. I sat beside him, took the book from his hands, held his fingers in mine like Mama used to do when we were little. Then I noticed the file at the foot of the bed. Medical charts, treatment records, a long list of recent procedures and updated prescriptions, and a signature at the bottom of the they, billing sheet, N. Anderson. I didn't tell Matthew. I didn't say a word to the doctors. I just walked out of that room and into the hallway, my ears ringing with disbelief. He paid. Not just for the meds, for everything. Weeks of inpatient care, blood tests, consultations, all under an alias I hadn't known existed until that moment. I called the number on the card James had given me back at the house. The butler. Always composed, always unreadable. "This is Emma Carter," I said. "Please tell Mr. Anderson." "Thank you." A pause. Then, "I will relay the message." I hung up without waiting for more. Mama woke up a few hours later. She smiled when she saw me. "You didn't have to come." "I did," I said. "And I'll keep coming, even after, She nodded, as if we were speaking of the weather. "He looks like a man who keeps quiet too long." "Who? The one you're marrying?" I blinked. "You've never even met him." "No, but I've met that type before." Her eyes softened. "Your father had that same silence about him. Thought carrying the weight alone was noble, until it nearly broke him. I don't know if Nathaniel has anything left to break. Then maybe he's waiting for someone to teach him how to heal." That afternoon, we sat in her hospital room while snowflakes dotted the window. She asked me about the Anderson estate, what it looked like. I described the long hallways, the smell of old wood, the way the chandeliers hummed faintly when no one was talking. She laughed. "Sounds lonely." "It is," I admitted. "But not empty?" I paused. "No, not empty." That night, back at the Anderson house, I found Nathaniel in the study. He wasn't reading. Just staring at a decanter of scotch on the table, untouched. "Is she all right?" he asked, before I could say anything. "She's stable." I hesitated. "Thank you." He didn't respond, just nodded once. I stepped further into the room. The firelight cast shadows across the shelves, throwing golden curves over the edges of leather-bound books. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. "Pay for her care." "Yes," he said, still not looking at me. I did. A beat. My father used to say there are debts worth more than money. "I know," he said. I sat down across from him. There was a moment, brief but certain, when I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Regret? Maybe. Exhaustion? Absolutely. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because it wasn't about you." That stung. More than I expected. "I mean," he corrected, "it wasn't a favor. It was a promise. One I made to myself the day I read your father's letter." He finally looked up at me. "I was 12 when your father pulled mine from that ravine. They said he would have frozen to death. And he never talked about it. Not once. I only found out after the funeral. I said nothing. Just listened. I remember thinking how strange it was that two men from such different worlds could trust each other in a moment that mattered, and how little anyone talked about it afterward, like it was too sacred to touch. I nodded. "That sounds like my dad." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. The fire cracked behind him, the only sound between us. "I didn't expect you to come back today," he said finally. "Why?" "Because if I were you, I wouldn't have." I smiled gently. "You're not me." He studied me, as if he hadn't quite decided whether that was a good thing. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I stayed in town once. Years ago. Drove past your father's shop." "Why?" He hesitated, I think I wanted to see what the man who saved my father looked like, but I didn't go in. I didn't want to intrude. "You should have," I said. "He would have given you coffee, and probably made you a vest without asking." Nathaniel's mouth twitched, a near smile. "I wasn't ready," he admitted. "Are you now?" The question hung in the air, not demanding an answer, just asking to be heard. Later, as I walked to my room, I passed the grand hallway again. The air was still. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It felt watchful, like the walls were waiting. And for the first time since I arrived, I wondered what it would feel like to stay. Not because of duty, not even because of debt, but because I was starting to believe this house might have room for something new, something like forgiveness, or maybe even love. I didn't sleep much the night after I returned from the hospital, not because of the silence. The Anderson estate had mastered silence, deep, obedient, and polished, the kind that curled around you like a velvet curtain. No, what kept me up was the space Nathaniel left behind in the study, the kind that doesn't look like loneliness at first glance, just absence. Like someone had stepped out of the room and forgotten to return for years. That night, I dreamt of my father. He was younger, sitting at his work table, a half-finished coat on his lap. He looked up and said only one thing. "You don't fix fabric by stretching it. You fix it by finding where the thread first broke." I woke up before sunrise. The wedding was 4 days away. There were fittings, legal documents, a polite note from someone named Meredith, Nathaniel's lawyer, or perhaps his assistant, asking if I preferred pearls or diamonds for the ceremony. "Pearls," I wrote back. Quiet. Honest. Not trying too hard. At breakfast, I found a linen napkin folded neatly on my plate. The kitchen was still. James poured coffee in silence. He never asked questions, just moved like a man trained to disappear between glances. "Where's Mr. Anderson?" I asked, almost casually. "He's in the conservatory, miss," James said. "You'll find him with the flowers." I hadn't expected a conservatory. But when I stepped into it, the light hit me like memory, all warm and yellow, filtered through glass. It wasn't grand like the rest of the house. In fact, it felt lived in. There were pots everywhere, plants not trimmed to perfection, but growing in wild, honest ways, overwatered in places, forgotten in others. And there he was. Nathaniel stood in front of a long workbench, shirt sleeves rolled, trimming the stems of a bouquet. Lavender. I stopped in the doorway, watched for a moment. "You grow these?" I asked finally. He turned, startled. They were my mother's. She used to keep them in the kitchen. I stepped closer. We had them too, in our backyard. My father always said lavender smelled like summer trying to stay. Nathaniel looked down at the flowers. Funny. My father hated the smell, said it reminded him of weakness. I waited. Let the silence breathe between us. Then he added quietly, "She planted them anyway." It was the first time I'd heard him speak of his mother. Something in his tone had shifted. Softer, yes, but also uncertain, like a man tiptoeing through a memory he hadn't visited in a long time. "She left when I was 10, he said. No note, no goodbye, just gone. I felt something catch in my chest, not pity, not exactly. "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded once, then returned to the bouquet. His hands, usually so precise, were clumsy today. He nicked his thumb on a thorn and didn't flinch. I moved closer, took the scissors gently from his hand and wrapped a tissue around the cut. "You don't have to bleed alone, you know," I said, not really thinking. That made him look at me. "Really look. I don't know how to do this," he said. "This?" I asked. Talk, share, feel, any of it. And then, after a moment, a quiet so fragile I was afraid to breathe, he whispered, I'm sorry." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed like an earthquake inside my ribs. I swallowed. "For what?" He blinked, as if he hadn't realized he'd said it out loud. "For the way I've handled this. You. All of it." I agreed to it. I said softly, "Yes, but that doesn't mean I've made it easy." He stepped back, gave me space. But his hands trembled now. Only slightly, but I saw it. My father taught me how to command, how to lead, how to win, but he never taught me how to care for someone. "He taught you to survive," I said, "not to stay." We stood there for a while, among the lavender and the lingering scent of damp soil. There was something healing about that room, not in what it held, but in what it didn't try to be. He finally said, "I booked the chapel because it's quiet. No press, no guests, just us." I nodded. "Do you want to cancel it?" he asked. "We still can. No one needs to know." "No," I said. "I want to go through with it. But I want something first." He looked up, wary. "Dinner," I said. "In the formal dining room, a real one. You and me. No lawyers, no lists." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "A date?" "A beginning," I said. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "All right." That night, James lit the candles in the dining room. The chandelier glowed like soft fire. The table was long, but he only set 2 places, close together. Nathaniel wore a navy suit, not his usual armor. Something less rigid. His tie was crooked. "You hate this, don't you?" I asked as we sat. "I don't know what to do with quiet. Rooms," he admitted. "I do," I said. "You listen to what isn't being said." We ate roast chicken and warm bread, talked about nothing at first. Books neither of us had finished, places we hadn't traveled to. But eventually, the silence turned gentle, comfortable. And when the meal was over, and we both lingered as if afraid to break the spell, he said something that stayed with me long after I went to bed. "I don't know what love is supposed to look like, but I think it might look a little like this." Later, lying in bed, I didn't think about contracts or debts or promises made by men who were long gone. I thought about Lavender, and a man who didn't know how to stay, but stayed anyway. There's a certain kind of dusk that doesn't belong to any clock, the kind that slips into the sky like a sigh, not quite day, not yet night, just stillness. Soft and suspended. That's the light we sat in when he finally let me in. The garden behind the Anderson estate was just beginning to wake after the long Vermont winter. The ground was still cold, but green had started to push through. Beneath, the skeletal branches of climbing roses, Nathaniel had a table set up. 2 chairs, a white linen cloth, and an awkward bouquet in the center, half tulips, half wildflowers that didn't quite match. I loved it immediately. "Don't expect me to do this often," he said when I arrived. "I don't usually dine with guests under my dead hedges. I'm not a guest," I said. "I'm your wife. Almost." That made him pause. Then he motioned to the seat across from him. "Dinner," he said simply. The food was warm and homemade, though not by his hands. James had prepared it, of course. But Nathaniel poured the wine, sliced the bread, and refilled my glass before I could ask. It was the first meal I'd had in months that didn't feel like a countdown. No appointments afterward, no lists, just slow eating and slower words. "I used to dream about dinners like this," I said. Not the setting exactly, but the quiet, the togetherness. He tilted his head. "You dreamed of marriage?" "I dreamed of having a place at a table, not because I earned it, just because I was wanted there." He said nothing for a while. Then, "You belong at every table you choose to sit at." There was a long pause, the kind that fills with more than air, and then, just as the wind shifted, he smiled. It was quick, barely there. But I saw it, in the corner of his mouth, in the softening of his jaw. "You smiled," I said, before I could stop myself. "No," he said too fast. I didn't. You did. He looked away, but the ghost of it lingered, like he didn't quite know how to take it back. It wasn't intentional. That's the best kind. As the sky darkened to lavender, I found myself studying him the way I used to study sketches in my father's workshop, trying to understand the story behind the lines. His face didn't invite questions, but it didn't push them away anymore either. His posture wasn't defensive. It was unguarded, like a gate had been left slightly ajar. I used to think silence meant someone had nothing to say, I said. But lately, I think maybe it just means no one's been listening long enough. Nathaniel looked at me. The kind of look that strips a room of pretense. I was raised by a man who spoke only when it served him, he said, and by a world that rewards distance. Do you want something different? He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. After dessert, a pear tart so delicately sliced it looked sculpted, he walked me back through the garden. The air had turned cooler, the kind of cool that crept into your sleeves and curled around your wrists. Shivered once. Without a word, he slipped off his blazer and draped it over my shoulders. It was warm, too large, and smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Thank you, I said. He nodded. You know, I added, this might be the first night since we met where neither of us mentioned the contract. Nathaniel slowed. Maybe that's a good sign. Maybe it means we're pretending well. Or maybe, he said quietly, it means we're not pretending anymore. Back at the house, he stopped at the base of the stairs. I expected him to disappear into the west wing, where he usually vanished. But instead, he lingered. There's something I want to give you, he said. He led me to the library. The fireplace was unlit. The room smelled like aged leather and pine. He crossed to a cabinet near the far wall and opened a drawer I hadn't noticed before. Inside, a small velvet box. He handed it to me without ceremony. I opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, not the one from the contract, that had been clinical, chosen by someone else. This one was different, simpler, older. A thin gold band with a single rose-cut sapphire in the center. Weathered but beautiful. It was my mother's, he said. She left it behind when she left. I looked up. She always said if I ever found someone who stayed, I should give them something that did too. I didn't say anything. Words felt too small. Instead, I slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit, are you sure? I asked. Yes, he said. Not a breath of hesitation. That night, as I undressed in the quiet of my room, I held my hand to the light. The stone glinted, not brightly, just enough, like it didn't need to shout to be seen. It didn't feel like ownership, or debt, or duty. It felt like being chosen, maybe not in love, not yet, but in intention, in the soft, terrifying act of opening one's door and hoping someone stays. I slept easily for the first time in weeks. And in the hallway, just outside my door, a man stood for several minutes before walking away. He never knocked, but he stayed long enough to try. It began with a letter, not from Nathaniel, not even from the lawyer I'd spoken to about wedding logistics. This envelope arrived tucked between a breakfast menu and a note from James about the heating pipes. Plain, ivory paper with an unfamiliar seal. Inside it read, Miss Carter, your presence is requested at the Anderson Foundation meeting this Friday at 10 a.m. in the East Boardroom. This concerns estate planning and relevant heirs per the revised last will and testament of the late Mr. Henry Anderson. Meredith Langston, Senior Legal Counsel. I blinked at the word. Heirs. I wasn't one. I wasn't even a wife. Not yet. So, what was I being asked to witness? When I brought the letter to Nathaniel, he didn't act surprised. Just tired. Every few years, someone tries to claim a piece of the empire, he said. usually around anniversaries or funerals. And now they think I'm vulnerable, because I'm getting married, because I'm not playing by the rules they expected. Who's they? He exhaled. My cousin, Edward. He said the name like someone says the word splinter. Friday came wrapped in fog, the kind that made the entire estate look like it had been dipped in milk. I dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but to protect. Long sleeves, high collar, my mother's brooch at the throat, a piece of her close to my heart. The East boardroom sat at the far end of the house. I'd never been in it. As James escorted me down the corridor, I noticed how much colder this part of the estate felt. Fewer paintings, no fresh flowers, just polished floors and formal silence. When we entered, I saw him instantly. Edward Anderson, mid-30s, handsome, in a way that was too smooth. His smile never touched his eyes. Well, he said, standing to greet me. So this is the tailor's daughter. He didn't offer a handshake. I nodded once. And you must be the cousin who calls board meetings like family interventions. He tilted his head. Fiery. I like her already. The meeting began. Edward had brought a motion to review Henry Anderson's will and challenge a portion of Nathaniel's control over the estate. The reason? Marriage under dubious terms, Edward said. To a woman with no financial history, no social standing, and no proof of long-standing relationship with the heir. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap. I have no objection to love, he added with a smile like glass. But when a man weds his father's debtor's daughter weeks before gaining full control of a fortune, one must ask, who benefits? Nathaniel said nothing. He let Edward speak. Let the air grow thick with suspicion and innuendo, until Edward turned to me directly and said, Tell me, Miss Carter, how long did you know Nathaniel before agreeing to become Mrs. Anderson? That's when Nathaniel stood. His chair scraped back against the hardwood like thunder in a quiet church. He walked forward slowly, placed both hands on the table and said, in a voice low, even, but sharp as frost, She doesn't owe you an explanation. Edward raised an eyebrow. I believe the board... I said, Nathaniel repeated, She doesn't owe you anything. He straightened, buttoned his jacket, and looked around the room. Emma Carter is here because she is part of this family. Not by blood, but by choice, by legacy. My father trusted hers. I trust her. That is the only endorsement that matters in this house. Silence. Absolute. He didn't look at me as he left the room, but the sound of his defense echoed long after he was gone. When I found him hours later, he was in the stables, brushing down a horse with more care than he gave most people. You didn't have to do that, I said from the doorway. He didn't turn around. Yes, he said. I did. I stepped closer. The scent of hay and cedar filled the air. Warm, honest, like the barns back home. You stood up for me, I said, because no one else in that room would have done it right. He finally faced me. His expression wasn't proud. It was weary, guarded. But under it, something new flickered. Fierce, protective. You didn't marry me for money, he said, and I sure as hell didn't marry you to keep peace with Edward. Then, why? I asked. The question hung there. He didn't answer. Not fully. But he reached into his coat pocket and handed me something wrapped in cloth. It was a tailor's thimble. Old, worn, silver. My father kept it, he said. Said it belonged to yours. I thought maybe you should have it now. That night, I sat in my room with the thimble in my palm, its metal still warm from his hands. I wasn't part of this world, not truly. But today, for the first time, it felt like someone had chosen to stand between me and the storm. Not because he had to, but because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being a contract and started being his person. It started with a ring at 4:42 a.m., I knew before I answered. I knew from the way the wind sounded that morning. Too still, too alert, like even the house had paused. My fingers hesitated over the screen. One missed call from the hospital. One new voicemail. I didn't listen to it. I just went. There was no sunrise, just gray, heavy and low. By the time I reached the hospital, the nurse at the front desk met my eyes with the soft look I'd seen once before, when we lost my father. No words, just a nod. Room 204 was quiet. The beeping had stopped. Mama lay there, hands folded, eyes closed like she'd simply drifted off. There was a fresh daffodil on the table beside her. I didn't know who had placed it there. Matthew arrived, 30 minutes later. He didn't say much. Just sat beside me, hand clutching mine as if we were both 7 again, hiding under the kitchen table during a thunderstorm. When the doctor came in, I didn't hear half of what he said. Only phrases that stuck like needles. She went peacefully. There wasn't pain. She waited. Waited for what? For whom? Me? For something I still hadn't figured out how to give? I stayed long after Matthew left. Long after the room emptied. The scent of lavender lotion still lingered on the sheets. Around noon, I went to the chapel on the first floor. Not because I believed in miracles, but because it was quiet. Because I didn't know where else to put my grief. I sat in the back pew, eyes dry, throat like cotton. There were stained glass windows overhead. Blue, gold, deep green. Mama used to say light like that looked like hope trying to speak. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt them. Nathaniel didn't sit beside me. He sat a few rows back, respecting space I hadn't asked for, but needed. I didn't know if I should come, he said. I turned. His suit was still damp from the rain. I didn't tell anyone, I whispered. I just left. You didn't have to. That was all. The service was small. A few neighbors, a cousin from Maine, some women from the diner where Mama worked. When we were little, the casket was closed. I'd already said goodbye, but it was the burial that undid me. It started raining as they lowered her down, the soft kind at first, then the kind that soaked your coat, your shoes, your bones. I didn't cry at the hospital, not during the service, but as the first clump of wet earth hit the wood, I broke, not loudly, not publicly, just a sound in my throat, raw and quiet, and a hand clutched to my chest like I was trying to hold something in that had already slipped away. That's when he moved. Not a word, no questions, just arms around me, strong and still. He pulled me close, his coat already soaked, and let me fall apart into him. His cheek pressed to the top of my head, one hand on the back of my neck. No performance, no bravado, just presence. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears finally falling. For what? He murmured. For dragging you into this. For asking you to stand in grief that isn't yours. He pulled back enough to look at me, his eyes steady and unreadable, but not cold. Grief is never about whose it is, just whether you're willing to carry it with someone. We stood there, unmoving, as the rain soaked through our shoes and turned the ground to mud. But neither of us cared. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to face a kitchen without her, a house that smelled like grief and forgotten cinnamon. So I said nothing, and that's when he said it. The word, the one I'd been afraid to want, stay. Whisper. But it held everything. Not go rest. Not do what you need. Just stay. We didn't return to the estate that night. He booked a room at a quiet inn on the edge of town, the kind with creaky floorboards and patchwork quilts. The receptionist didn't even blink when she saw us. One room, no luggage, no questions. I lay in bed that night, still wearing his sweater, my fingers tracing the stitching on the hem. He slept in the chair by the window, arms crossed, breathing steady, There was no wedding yet. No vows spoken. But in that quiet room, with nothing left to give and nothing left to lose, he had given me something better than ceremony. He chose to stand beside me in the rain. In the morning, I woke to find a note on the nightstand. Went to get coffee. Sit tight. And yes, I mean stay. Nan, underneath it, a small velvet pouch. Inside, my mother's brooch. Cleaned. Polished. Whole. I hadn't even realized I'd left it behind. He'd gone back. For me. For her. For us. There are some mornings that feel borrowed. Like the world is handing you one extra page before it turns the chapter. That morning felt like that. The snow had melted overnight, and the sun touched the windows of the Anderson estate like it meant something, like it remembered. The birds were louder than usual, even though spring hadn't fully arrived. The world felt paused and possible. I arrived home just before noon, not to the house I grew up in. That had been emptied, cleaned, and closed with care by neighbors who understood what silence meant. No casseroles, no long condolences, just folded blankets and stocked cabinets. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself. No. I came home to the estate. But this time, I didn't enter like a guest. I walked in like someone who knew the way. Nathaniel wasn't in his office. He wasn't in the garden or the study or the dining room that still held echoes of our last real conversation. I found him in the kitchen, of all places, sleeves rolled, coffee brewing, reading the newspaper like it was any other day. There was something deeply disarming about seeing him there, in socks, on tile. He looked up and said only one word. Morning. I didn't answer at first. I just walked to the counter where he'd set 2 mugs, poured one, and stood beside him. I thought about leaving, I said. I would have let you. I know. He folded the paper and set it aside, slow and deliberate. I would have hated it, he said quietly, but I wouldn't have stopped you. Then he reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a thick manila envelope. My name was written on the front in his handwriting, not cursive, not typed. Just simple, steady block letters. He handed it to me. I opened it. Inside, our contract, the original. Crisp pages, clipped at the corner, full of terms we'd both lived by for too long. I thought we had 12 months, I said. We did. And it's only been 6. Nathaniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. I was going to wait until the year was up, let you walk away with no guilt. But after your mother's funeral, I realized something. I looked at him. He didn't waver. I'm done living by rules made out of fear. He reached for the envelope, took the pages, lit a match. The flame was small at first. Then it took. The papers curled and blackened in the sink, the edges glowing orange, then fading to ash. We both watched, silent, as the terms vanished. All. The conditions, the caveats, the clauses. Gone. You're free, he said simply. Truly. I looked at the ashes, then at him, and something in me unlocked. I went upstairs, took my time, changed out of my black coat, brushed my hair the way Mama used to. Slow, careful, one side at a time. Then I pulled out the ring, not the one from the contract, the sapphire one, his mother's, the one that had waited decades for. The right hand. I slipped it on and walked back down. He was still in the kitchen, washing dishes now, like we hadn't just dismantled an entire agreement. I'm not staying, I said, and he looked up sharply. Unless, I added, you're willing to ask me again. Ask you what? To marry you, this time, because you want to. Not because your father did, not because of a debt. He stared at me for a long second. Then, in a motion so steady it might have been rehearsed, he dried his hands, walked over, and stood in front of me. Emma, he said, will you marry me? No contracts? No contracts, no board meetings, just dinner and breakfast, and whatever comes in between. I smiled. Then yes. The ceremony happened 2 weeks later. No fanfare, no announcements, just a little chapel near the orchard line, where the wildflowers had begun to bloom despite the frost. I wore a simple cream dress. He wore navy. James served as our witness. The minister was someone who didn't ask questions. Afterward, we didn't throw rice. We didn't cut a cake. We just walked home, hand in hand, through the long gravel drive. The birds sang. The air was cool and honest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt full. Not with relief, but with peace. That night, I made tea in the kitchen, barefoot, humming a song Mama used to sing while folding laundry. He watched me from the doorway. "What?" I asked. He smiled. "You look like you belong here." "I do. You always did." Later, as we lay in bed, tangled in soft sheets and steady breath, he traced a finger down my wrist and said, "You stayed." And I answered, "So did you." And we did. Not because of paper, not because of names, but because somehow, in the wreckage of promises made by other men, we found something truer. A love not built on obligation, but on choice. And we chose to stay. Together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like. It helps more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, filled with quiet strength and second chances, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening, and take good care of your heart.